As I like to do, I want to tell a story on myself, a little icebreaker, a little get my jitters out and just work things out. And there was a time, I think I was probably about 13 or 14. It's hard to remember all of the details because, come on, that was like 10 years ago. So there was an arcade that had opened, if any of you remember it, down on 30th Street in Scheid. Somebody had opened an arcade with the big video games and all of that. And I had it in my head that I wanted to go down to that arcade and play some video games. But I didn't have anybody to go with me, and I'm a little shy. I don't, going to a place for the first time, I don't like doing that. So I got my pocket full of money and had stuff saved up, all these quarters, and I ride my bike down there. I don't think I was even really supposed to have done it. It kind of snuck out and rode all the way from Terrace Avenue down to 30th Street in Scheid, and stood there and contemplated about going into this arcade, and I turned and looked behind me, and there was Jolly Pirate Donuts. Now, if you guys know me, you know I likes me some donuts, a lot. So I ended up riding my bike across over to Jolly Pirate, and I go inside, and I'm just going to get a couple donuts. I'm thinking this is awesome because, see, when I was a kid, my mom would buy a dozen donuts, and then she would take and cut each one in half, and then she would wrap it in plastic wrap, and you were allowed to have a half a donut. So I thought, this is awesome. I got a pocket full of change. I'm having a couple donuts. I get in there. I look at the price. I don't remember how much it was for a dozen, but I had enough. So I'm standing there like a kid at the candy store, at the donut store, and I'm going through and I'm picking out, I like the apple one with the apple filling, the cinnamon, spice, the apple spice. I like that one. Oh, give me one of those Long Johns, the Bismarck. Oh, and give me one of those ones that look like the tractor tire. Yeah, I wouldn't need one of those. And I'm going through and I'm picking out all my favorites, strawberry-filled, vanilla-filled, chocolate-filled, everything I could think of. And remember, back then, I don't know if they still do it, it was a baker's dozen. So I got 13. So I got my 13 donuts, got my box, and I get on the bicycle, and I have to ride one-handed trying to, get this treasure home. So I get all the way to the house, I kind of get to the neighbors because our house set way back, and I get to where I kind of stop the bike and see, is anybody in the driveway? Nope. I ride on down the driveway. I take this box, and I go and I put it outside my bedroom window, and I go ahead and put my bike in the garage. I come in the house, and, I slip down to my room. I go in my room, I open the window, and I reach out, and the box of donuts is gone. No, not really. It was there. So I got the box of donuts. I got the box of donuts, and I brought it in, and I went to my dresser drawer, and I pulled it out, and I pushed clothes out of the way, and I set it down in there, and then I lifted the lid, and I got out the apple-spiced one, and this is awesome, and I closed the lid, and I covered up the clothes so nobody knows I've got these donuts. And I closed the drawer, and I ate that donut so fast, I don't think I even enjoyed it, because I didn't want anybody to know I had them, right? So I'm eating this donut, and I just scarf it down, and I go out to play. A couple hours later, I come back, I'm going to my treasure, and I open the drawer, I push the clothes back, they're gone. No, not really, they're still there. So anyway, I take and I open the lid to get another donut, and the entire box of donuts was covered in ants. Covered in ants. Can you throw up Matthew 6, 19 and 20 for me? This was a good time to learn this one. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves, stupid ants, break in and steal. Instead, store for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. So, don't put the next one up yet. So, the lesson is, had I just taken the box of donuts and owned up to it and brought it in and shared it with the family, I probably would have got 2 or 3 of them, at least until Mom cut them in half and put the plastic wrap around them. So, I would have gotten blessings for sharing with the family. Throw up the next verse. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. My heart was in my dresser drawer, being selfish, instead of with the family. And I got to talking to my mom about that, and I was trying to remember all the details. I said, you used to cut those up, cut them in half, and cover them with plastic. Why'd you do that? And she said, well, there's a couple reasons. One, I cut them in half so that everybody could get a taste of the different flavors. It wasn't just one person eating the chocolate-filled. Somebody else could have a chocolate-filled. And then the other reason was it helped kind of keep the donuts fresh. Plus, it kept out the ants. So Mama was smart. So those are the lessons you learn in life. So, hey, getting into the message here, I want to look at Romans 8, 28 to 30. We're going to kind of refer back to this several times in this message. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. So I want to tell you the story of a young man named Maywin. Now, first off, that's kind of a weird name. That's got, his parents really had good trust in how he was going to succeed, right? He may win. So he was, his family was kind of upper class, maybe you considered nobles. And, he grew up in the life of having people wait on him, and he was accustomed to that. And one day in his village, these savages, these barbarians, these slave traders, these pirates came on to their shore. They slayed a bunch of the servants and just gathered up anybody that looked like they could be a worker and take them off. And they took them back to their country and sold them up and down the coast of their country to whoever would buy them. So Maywin winds up being a slave, coming from this time or this land where he was essentially a prince. Maybe not quite that high, but, treated as such because of his father's status. Now, his family were Christians, but he wasn't really practicing so much, wasn't really very devout in his faith. And now he finds himself being sold off to what would be a chieftain in a village, in a country, on an island, nowhere near his home, being kind of destitute and alone. And he's basically put out in these remote pastures watching sheep and taking care of pigs. So as he's out there, the weeks turn into months and months drag on. He's going through times of just being cold and wet and starving and trying to adjust to his environment. So as he's going through this, he begins to fall back on the faith that he knew, his faith in Jesus. And he begins to pray. And in his words, he said that he prayed up to 100 times a day and just as often at night. And his relationship began to grow deeper and deeper with God. After about 5.5 years or so, being in this condition, he heard the voice of the Lord come to him. And he said, "It is good that you fast. Soon you will return home." Now, he's thinking, I'm on an island completely away from my homeland. I don't know how far away I really am. I know that the penalty for running away is death. Anyone who helps someone that's a runaway slave, the penalty was death. But he continues on, and a few weeks or months later, he hears the voice of the Lord again, and he says to him, "Go now, your ship awaits." So Maywin gathers a few things and heads out. And he's moving quick. He's running. He's just trying to stay away from everyone. He's staying away from villages, mostly traveling at night. His journey winds up taking him south to the coast. He was in the northwest part of this place. It takes him south of the coast, almost 200 miles for him to get there. And the Lord leads him to this ship. So the ship, he goes and he talks to the captain. And now at this point, he hadn't been nervous the entire time, but now he's nervous because he has to reveal who he is. He basically tells the captain, I'm a runaway slave, to let him know that he's taking on this risk of helping him. Well, the captain denies him passage. So he turns away, walks away a little distance and drops to his knees and starts to pray. And after a couple of minutes, as he's finishing his prayer, he hears a voice of someone behind him saying, come on, let's go. And they decided to go ahead and take him with them. So they set sail, and he makes it home 6 years after being held captive in this land. They didn't speak his language. He had to learn a new language. He had to learn new customs. So he gets home, and his faith walk with Jesus and with the Lord, they've gotten a lot closer. And he decides, I'm going to enter into the priesthood. So he goes to seminary and starts to receive training. Well, one night while he's sleeping, he has a dream of one of those guys from that land where he was held captive standing there and hands him a scroll. And he starts to look at the scroll, and it says something along the lines of, our people's voices cry out for you. And then he hears a bunch of different voices say, return to us, holy boy, and walk amongst us once again. So he goes and he petitions to his teachers, let me go back to this land where I was held captive. I want to bring them Jesus. These guys are heathens, they're pagans. I want to bring them Jesus. They deny it. They say, no, you're not ready. He progresses to deacon, then to priest, and after several decades, he becomes a bishop. And he petitions again to go back. And this time they allow him, and they say, we feel like you're hearing from the Spirit on this. Now, other people that had gone into this land before had had no success. They were either killed or ran off. But he knew the language, and he knew the customs. He took with him gifts because it was a gift-giving society. He took lots of things with him that he could go to the king, and he goes to the king and talks to the king and basically receives safe passage to come into the land. So he gets a little parcel of land and he builds a small house and starts to witness to the people around him. Now these pagans, they had multiple gods, multiple deities. You know, he was up against a lot trying to explain to them that there is only one God, one true God. Now, one of their sacred things in their pagan faith was water. So as he's talking with them, you know, he leads them to the water, which is kind of a sacred, like the streams, to baptize them. And this ties in. So he gets the idea. He starts trying to tie in some of their customs with his own customs to bring them together. Long story short, Joel, he ends up turning this entire area around him, he converts them into Christianity. And it continues to grow and grow and grow. After his death, and even right before that, they began to build monasteries and start training people. The faith became very, very strong in that country. And when the Dark Ages hit in 500 AD, it became a place of literacy. They were training people. They were storing up literature. They were storing up sacred documents. From 500 to 1000 AD became such a dark period that basically everyone became illiterate. And in order to learn or know anything, you had to go to one of these monasteries that had been set up, all because of him listening to what God had said and going back to a people that had offended him, that had held him captive, that had treated him poorly. But he answered that call. Now, what I didn't tell you was that Maewyn, when he became a priest, was given a new name. Patricius in Latin, or Patrick in Welsh, or as we know it in English, Patrick. So happy St. Patrick's Day to you. And now you know the rest of the story. That's a little Paul Harvey thing. You young ones may not get that. So the thing is, I never, until I researched this, I didn't realize all of what St. Patrick had done. Literally, all of Europe was rebuilt out of Ireland. And there's the allegory that he ran all the snakes out of Ireland. Now, there's no record of any snakes ever being in Ireland. It was an allegory for, basically, he ran out the Druids and the pagans, all of the serpentine spirits. But it was all because he listened, and he went through the testing. He went through the training. What he thought was absolute torture was actually training. Why was he there 6 years? He was there 6 years because that's how long it took him to master the language and to learn and master the customs. I think if he'd have learned it earlier, he may have only been held 4 or 5 years. But also his faith grew deeper to the point where God needed him in that time period. So let's go back and look at Romans 8:28-30 again. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. I think that scripture fits that story really well. So, I want to talk about, now jump over to, Pastor Josue basically mentioned Joseph and brought him up in his message 2 weeks ago when he was talking about dreams. So I want to talk about Joseph from the avenue of what we're discussing here. And we know the story. He had a dream, a couple of dreams, that he told his brothers that basically said, one day you're going to bow down to me. I saw this in a dream. And of course, he was the father's favorite child. The brothers hated him for that. And they conspired against him. And we know the story. They threw him in a pit. Some slave traders came along, took him to Egypt, and sold him to the master of the guard. And he rose to the highest position in that house that he could rise until Potiphar's wife did what she did, and he got thrown back in prison. Now, one of the things I didn't realize when I read that through those passages before, that the prison was actually at Potiphar's house. He was the head of the guard. His house was at the prison. So he was still on that location. It's just a little tidbit I picked up I didn't ever realize from reading that. So he's in prison, and he starts rising through the ranks within the prison, and kind of, you know how the story goes. He becomes at the highest place that he can be in the prison, watching over other prisoners. We have the cupbearer and the baker that show up and have their dreams, and he interprets the dreams. And of course, he tells, the cupbearer, you're going back to the king, back to your position. And he tells the baker, you're done. Wasn't a good word to get, and it happened. So we know that the cupbearer says, I will let them know about you. And he doesn't. Well, why doesn't he? Why doesn't he? Because it wasn't time yet. God had basically blinded the cupbearer, or messed up his memory, if I can say that, kind of blinded him to what he was supposed to do, because it wasn't his time yet. Because if Joseph had been released from the prison early, he wouldn't have been in that place for the Pharaoh to call upon him when they needed someone to interpret his dream. And we know that by him interpreting Pharaoh's dream, that put him in a position to be in charge of everything with the grain. And then his brothers had to come to him, not knowing who he was, looking something like off the cover of National Geographic with King Tut or something. They didn't recognize him with all the guy liner. And what I think is funny is that he waits what is it here? 3 chapters. He waits 3 chapters to reveal who he is. It was a little sneaky. So we have Joseph, who basically went through all of these things that prepared him for what he had to go through. He could have looked at it negative. He could have gotten depressed. But he rose within the ranks where he was at. He bloomed where he was planted. I want to take a look at Psalm 37:23. We know this one. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way. Each one of those two in these examples, neither of these two guys, Patrick or Joseph, would have been able to be used in the capacity they were used if it weren't for the preparation they went through in their trials. Yeah. They both endured hardship, pain, and loss, and were able to persevere and learn necessary skills through it. They were able to go on and function in a higher role and fulfill the purpose that God put on their life. We all have a calling. Not everyone will be called to function in a role as high or as important as what God called Patrick and Joseph into, but we all have a calling. There are things that we need to learn and receive, training for us to operate at the level that he called us. One of the speakers last weekend at Love is Red said it this way. It was a good statement. He said, many times people point out our weaknesses to us, but it is these perceived weaknesses that can actually become our greatest strengths. And I'll add, especially when God is involved. Trials, troubles, and challenges will always come our way. There is nothing that we can do to avoid that. Sometimes they are of our own making, and sometimes they're an attack from the enemy, and sometimes they're a divine appointment. But in any one of these cases, he will use these times to test our heart. Proverbs 17:3 says, the crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. How we respond is crucial. If we immediately go negative when things occur, we become depressed. And we are less likely to rise above that situation. And when this happens, we can be sure that that test will come again and again and again. Over and over until we get it. Until we pass that test. If our heart is right in our response during the trouble, and we have a positive outlook, we're more likely to rise above that situation and come out victorious. When we pass a test like this, however, the enemy will come back around and see if we still stand firm in our resolution in the matter. You can be sure of this. Sorry, I had to write some of this down. I was thinking it out last night. I thought, that's good. I'm going to forget that. So I want to have Jared throw up that PowerPoint. About, it was probably 10 years ago, back when I was 13 or 14. I was doing testing for Samsung, and we would drive around this test area. And it was out in a rural area because it was supposed to be a bad signal area. And I kept driving past this field. It was a big circle that we drove around. So I would see this field about once every 3-4 minutes, maybe 5. And I kept looking at that field as I passed it, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason to how these plants are in that ground. But that road that I was on curved around the field. Next slide. And as you turn that corner, you can see that those plants are in perfect order. Where the farmer had put them. Perfect order, exactly where they needed to be. You can compare the two. So we've got the comparison there between what appears to be absolute chaos in what appears to be perfect order. That's the same field. I used this illustration in a class that I did back in the leadership school for another purpose, but along the same lines. It's the same field. One looks like chaos, the other one perfect order. What's the difference? It's our perspective. So when we're going through a hard time or a trouble or something comes against us, if we start looking at it negatively and get depressed over what's going on, that's all we're going to get out of that situation. But if we look at that as an opportunity to see, what's God trying to teach me here? I'm not saying God brought it against you, but in every single instance, there's something you come against. Maybe it's a chance to learn patience. And I bid you never pray for patience. You will get every terrible driver in Newark in front of you, I guarantee it. I still haven't passed that one yet. So every single one of those, every single thing you run into, there is a negative way to look at it and there's a positive way to look at it. Victim mentality is to look at it and say, oh, woe is me, this is always happening, this always happens, well, that goes, I was coaching upwards basketball this year and had one kid that said, well, I always have to sit the bench. Oh, you never throw me the ball. And it was always negative, 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 negative. And guess what? He didn't get thrown the ball. Had he not done that and would go in and just play the game and show that he was there and not have that negative attitude, people pick up on that. That is in your spirit. You're exuding that. You are oozing it. And people pick up on it. We wonder why. I had the lyrics to a song that I wrote once, and this is going way off notes. Lyrics to a song that I wrote that basically said, and if I started over, a brand new life far away, it would start all over, the same old life, it's sad to say. And it's true, because everywhere you go, there you are. The change starts with you. You have to get a positive outlook about every situation that you're going through and see, what is it that God is teaching me here? What is it that He's training me in so that when I come to the point where He's going to use me, I have what I need to know, and I've learned what I need to learn to be able to go out and do what He's called me to do. Right? The potter chooses what vessel he's going to make and what its use is for. And you know what? Maybe you wind up a wash basin. It's still very important. Maybe you don't wind up being the goblet that holds the wine for the king. Maybe you're a piece in between. But everybody has a purpose. And when we're going through those situations, we need to find, I stole this from Pastor Jeff, we need to find the purpose in the pain. I wasn't going to use this because I wanted to make a full message out of it. But I was thinking about when Pastor Osway started to do this series on coffee. And it's an acronym for the different items he was talking about. But I got to thinking about it, and I thought, coffee is a great thing to use in this regard, because when you look at everything from the planting process to the harvest to where they take those beans and they begin to roast them. And that roasting, if we look at it, is the trials and things that we go through that help break us beyond where we're at and help us learn. The weaker the roast, and there's like 385 degrees, it gets to what they call the first crack, where it dries out enough that the beans begin to crack. And there's an actual sound that the roaster hears, and they know, I've arrived at first crack. And that would be a light roast. And the thing with the light roast is, it retains a lot of the flavors of the original plant, of the original bean. And all of that's affected by elevation, area it was planted in, moisture content, other things around it. I mean, you've got beans from Africa that have a slight blueberry flavor to them. Ones from India that have more of a little bit of a spicy, dirty, like kind of a earthy taste to them. you know? So the beans where they're grown is one thing. How they're roasted decides what that overall flavor is going to be. And if it's a light roast and it's done, basically stopped at the 385 degrees after the first crack, a lot of those flavors from the region it was in are maintained. So if we go through a light roasting, a lot of our old self is still there. Now, we go to a medium roast, it kind of tames that down a little bit. But now we're a little bit further on, but it's still there. The dark roast is right after what they call the second crack, to where it's now dried out even more. And if we go too much beyond that, it basically turns into carbon and then combusts and just burns up. So there's a point where God won't take us past what we can't handle.
Amen. That's good.
You know?
Yeah.
He's going to take us and roast us right to the point of perfection. Now, maybe you had an upbringing that didn't take you too far, excuse the expression, too far beyond the other side of the tracks. And maybe a light roast is okay for you. But maybe you were way down a road you shouldn't have been. And maybe it'll take a dark roast to get you to where he needs you so that you exude his flavor. You exude the flavor of the roast. Can we throw up James 1, 2-4, please? Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. These are refrigerator verses. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Let's just stew on that for a minute. You throw 4 up again. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So the point of that is, don't try to take a shortcut. You know, an example of this, I mean, you got to run right at it. When you've got troubles going on, don't try to get out of it. You're there for a reason. I'm saying don't take the easy way. You need to get out of it, but don't take the easy way out. And an example of this, last month, I'm guilty of this. Last month, I was running about $500 short on my house payment. And instead of trusting God and praying about the situation and seeing where the money could come from, I ran to my home equity line of credit, wrote a check for $500, dropped it into my account, boom, done, 5 minutes, over. Problem solved. Never even prayed about it. Previously, Pastor Jeff brought up the example of the butterfly coming out of that cocoon, that monarch butterfly. If you try to help it out of the cocoon, it will die. Because it takes that squeezing, that pressure, to push the fluid out into the wings as it's coming out of that cocoon. Another example I'd like to use of this, along the similar lines. When we get sick, our white blood cells and other cells in that process exude a little chemical. They release it. It gets picked up in the brain by the hypothalamus. And what does it do? It raises our body temperature. That is the body's natural defense. So when we're sick, the body raises the temperature so that it puts the virus out of that 98 degrees that it loves and puts it into an environment where it slows down. It gives our body, our immune system, time to attack and kill that virus. Now, what do? This day and age, I got a fever of 101, Tylenol. So we're not feeling good because we have a fever, and we run right to something to get rid of the fever immediately, and now we've cut off God's natural process of healing the body. We allow the virus to continue on and live longer than if we would have just allowed the temperature. My dad, when he used to get sick, he'd go get on the treadmill and run. Now, obviously, there's a point where your temperature can hit dangerous levels, 105, 106. Then you get a nice ice bath or alcohol bath. Never had one of those and don't want to. So, there's natural processes. And if we try to jump and go around those and look for the easy way out of the situation and not pray about it, not get God involved, that situation is going to come back around. It's going to keep rearing its ugly head until we cut it off. Let's look at 1 Peter 4, 12 to 19. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. For it is time for judgment to begin with God's household. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Sorry, these glasses are driving me crazy. And if it is hard for the righteous to be saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? So then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. Now, I'm not wishing suffering on you by any means, but I want to exhort you that when those troubles and those things come on, look for the lesson in it. Look for the lesson and look and get out of it what it is that God's got for you in that. When I spoke the last time, I brought up Hebrews 12, 4 to 11. And we can just look at verse 4, really. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. That's a fun verse. Yeah, let's continue on. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best. But God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. For those who have been trained by it. Again, there's training. It's training. Let's take a look real quick at James 1:12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. That's pretty exciting. We all have a calling. We all have a calling. I mean, there's obvious callings. Yes, we have a calling to God, and we get there through our Savior, Jesus Christ. We have a calling to love the Lord, our God, with all our heart, all our mind, and all our strength, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. which has a prerequisite that we love ourselves. I keep saying I'm going to do a message on that, and I will eventually. We have a calling within the church body. We have a calling inside of this house. There is something that you are called to do in this house. It may be putting pieces of paper in the back of the chair, but it needs done. It may be sweeping. It may be greeting people out front. It may be helping people in the parking lot get in on a snowy day. Every single one of us has a calling within this church. We are all part of a family, and each one of us has our chores. Amen. We each have our thing to do, our calling. But now there's another calling, because Jesus said to us, go into all the world and preach the gospel. That was a mandate given to all of us. So that is a calling outside of these four walls. So we have a calling within the four walls, but we have a calling outside of these four walls. We need to get out there. We've got a community that's dying around us, and we have the answer. We have the antidote, not the Tylenol. Let's look at Romans 8:28 again, 8:28 through 30, under all this different light. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. They're out there. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, you've been called. He also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. Let's continue. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons, neither the present, nor the future, nor any powers, neither height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. So we all have a calling. Every single one of us. And we've gone through lessons in life already. We've been given them. Like my donut story, it may have not been a training, well, to not be selfish. Still working on that. But we've all been through something. We've all had those moments where we were placed in situations that weren't comfortable. And we needed to learn something out of that. So I'm going to give you some homework this week. I want you to think back in your life when you went through something and see if you can find the lesson God wanted you to get from it and how that lesson became training for something else. Something else he had in store for you. And if you would like to share these stories with me, I'd like you to email that to me. I would love to read those stories. Just write down something that happened. You can be brief about it, something you went through, the lesson that God taught you through that. And then if you can tie it to something that it became training for, that's awesome. If you want to share those on the family page, I encourage that. But I would love to hear those stories. I know that's not like a super happy message today, but it is, because training puts us in a place where we're able to overcome the next obstacle easier. It sets us up for what we're called to do. I imagined myself long ago doing something like this right here. I never imagined how it was going to come to pass. I never thought that it would occur in the way that it occurred. And that was a big step of faith to come out of the job that I was at, to step into this. But there was training along the way. Every single thing that I've had, that I've picked up electrical skills along the way in my life. I've picked up plumbing skills. I've picked up all these different skills. And guess what? I'm using them in here. I keep saying, Cooper is, an intern in here, and I keep giving him all these things that we're doing, and it seems like it's like a Mr. Miyagi paint the fence moment. And maybe that's not troubles and hardship and trials, but I kind of think it is, because I don't think he enjoys it. But it's training, because when you become a pastor of a small startup church that you're being seeded out to run, guess who's doing the work? You, until you find some volunteers that you can count on, like Herb and Charles, who put that door in for me. Love you guys. So every single thing that we go through, there's a reason, there's something behind it, and find the purpose in the pain. Find it, because it's there for a reason.